If you're like me, the ending in episode 3 of Game of Thrones of how they wrapped up the whole Night King scenario was rather disappointing to you. And I find myself fantasizing about all the different ways that it could have ended. So I thought, why not take it one step further and actually make a video about it? So if you're not too happy with how Game of Thrones ended and you want to convince yourself in some alternate reality there's another ending, at least until George R. R. Martin's books come out, then this is for you. So we start off in the Battle of Winterfell. However, in this version, when Jon Snow gets surrounded and swarmed by all the walkers, rather than him being saved by Dany with the dragon, they all grab a hold of him and basically just pin him down. They don't kill him, they just hold him and pin him down. Meanwhile, in the crypts, all of the walkers that are reanimated and bust out of the crypts, they do a similar thing with Sansa. They swarm her, grab her, and hold onto her. Meanwhile, when the Night King finally approaches Bran, the Night King looks at Bran, he looks at the weirwood tree, he looks back at Bran, and we get the sense that the two of them kind of understand what the deal is here. And Bran ever so slightly shakes his head, refusing whatever the unspoken understanding is between them. Then Arya attacks. It happens just like in the show. She stabs him, only in this version, he throws her off, all the White Walkers grab her, pin her down as well, and he just pulls the knife out and it doesn't affect him at all. Why? Because he's got dragon glass in his chest, he's immune to dragon fire. Why Valyrian steel, which is a mixture of dragon fire and some dragon glass, should even matter with him? It shouldn't. Now the Night King gestures at his White Walkers and they drag both Jon and Sansa towards the weirwood tree and line up all three of the Starks side by side. Where is Dany during all of this? Well, she's up in the skies defeating the Ice Dragon, which is where she should be. Meanwhile, back on the ground, the Night King draws his ice spear and he begins to approach the now 3 captured Starks. Bran calls out for him to stop, and he does. Bran then takes off his glove and places his hand on the weirwood tree. The Night King approaches the tree and he also places his hand on it. Bran's eyes fog over and we receive a bunch of flashes of visions. And like most visions, we see images of things that are to come in the future, things that have happened in the past, and more specifically, things that are going to happen in the upcoming episodes. We see the original Long Night from thousands of years ago. We see the last hero of the First Men traveling north, further than anyone had seen before. We see Azor Ahai forging a sword over and over and over again. We don't know exactly what these visions are, but we know they're very important. The visions end, and the ground all around the weirwood tree cracks and freezes solid in strips of ice, shooting out from the tree in all directions across the ground. Bran's eyes turn back to normal, and without a sound, the Night King, his White Walkers, and all of his Whites, they simply turn around and leave, disappearing back into the night. Once they're gone, the 3 Starks race over to Bran and they ask him what just happened. He simply says, "I made a promise." Then he looks at Jon and says, "But you'll be the one who has to keep it." Then he passes out. The episode ends with the camera zooming out vertically straight up, revealing that the strips of ice that shot out from the weirwood tree have formed the spiral pattern that we've seen the White Walkers use very frequently. Now for the next few episodes, Bran is going to be in a coma, and this is not just to keep him sidelined. There is a very specific reason why he needs to be in a coma for the time that he does. And while he's in this coma, we can wrap up the Cersei Lannister story, and they can end that however they want. It doesn't really matter to this. We're talking specifically about the Night King here. But I'd be fine with her just losing the battle, and then because she doesn't want to give up, she wants to burn King's Landing to the ground with wildfire, so Jaime has to kill her to save the city. Once again, history repeating itself. And then Jon and Dany can take the throne together. Now, in the final episode, this is where it all comes together. This is where we finally get the resolution and all the answers that we need. The episode begins with there being a time jump of a whole year for this final episode. And there's going to be a bunch of flashbacks throughout the episode to tie up what happened over the last year. And also not to spoil how the show is going to end up prematurely. But the final episode starts with Jon Snow venturing north of the Wall, reminiscent to how the last hero from long ago did. And we get our first flashback showing that Jon and Dany took the throne together and Dany became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When we flash forward again to present time, we see that Jon is not alone on this journey. He actually has his baby son with him. Jon is making camp for the night when the woods around him start to stir and he draws his sword from his hip. He starts to see shadows moving amongst the trees and getting closer to him when a second flashback kicks in. Bran awakens from his year-long coma and he tells Jon that he made a deal with the Night King to end the war and to stop the long night before it begins. And the spiral shape is a symbol of this pact. It's a pact pact that the last hero made centuries ago with the Night King to end the long night, but that men had now forgotten. Even the Starks in the north, which are supposed to remember, had forgotten, but Bran has reinitiated this pact. He says to Jon, "It's now time for you to head north of the wall and to give the Night King what was promised. It's the price of peace." And Jon asks, "What did you promise him?" Jumping back to present, the White Walkers step out from the tree line all around Jon. Jon's son starts crying, and Jon stands over his baby son with a foot on either side of him. Jon calls out defiantly to the White Walkers around him, "Him, not you." After a tense moment's pause, the White Walkers fade back into the woods and leave the two of them alone. The next day, the morning sun rises to find Jon half awake, sitting beside his son. Ice is laying across his lap, and the frost of the night has coated the blade in a layer of ice that's so thick not even the campfire is able to melt, rendering his sword useless. So he ties it to the saddle of his horse and continues on with his baby in arms. As he rides, the third flashback kicks in. Bran has just told him what we have all already figured out, that to end the war with the Night King, Jon needs to give the Night King his firstborn son. Bran explains that the White Walkers were created by the children of the forest in an effort to wipe out mankind because men were taking all their land. But with the children having gone extinct, their magic has unbound the White Walkers from this purpose. They now can choose their own path, and they just want to live, they just want to survive like all other life forms. But since White Walkers cannot reproduce themselves, they need human babies to perpetuate their species, and if they wiped out humans, they would die out too. So they made a deal with the last hero to not invade the world of men as long as they receive a steady supply of babies to keep their kind alive. Krastas fulfilled this purpose, which is why they never attacked him. But once the child offerings ended, the White Walkers were now facing extinction, so they had no choice but to invade south of the wall and force a renewal of the agreement. And as a sign of good faith, they have withdrawn north of the wall, but the first of the offerings to them must be the firstborn son of Jon and Dany. This would explain why the White Walkers stayed north of the wall for thousands of years without any problem, and why at the start of the show, only then did they start to move south, because the offerings were drying up. It also explains why there would be a 1-year time jump before this final episode. They needed to wait that first year for Jon and Dany's first child to be born. Jon eventually rides out of the trees into a clearing. As he does, he sees the White Walkers that confronted him last night on either side of him at a distance. They're shadowing him step by step, staring at him the whole time but not coming any closer, just acting kind of like an escort as he moves further and further north. In the distance, a structure starts to come into view, the Ice Palace. A fourth flashback kicks in. Jon is alone, churning over what Bran has told him that he has to do, when Davos appears behind him. He approaches Jon and he tells him about the night that he killed Melisandre, which happened during the 1-year jump, not at the Battle of Winterfell like in the show, because if she is going to die, she really deserves to get it from Davos, considering all the evil things that she's done. He tells Jon that Melisandre knew as soon as she saw him that night that this was the night that she would die, but she asked Davos to do her one last favor, to give Jon something, a special gift that will protect Jon's son in the darkest of nights. Davos leads Jon down into the bowels of the castle, where they find Gendry crafting a sword in the forge. Also with him is Beric Dondarrion, who tells Jon that they've been working 100 days and 100 nights since his son was born to forge this sword. Jon looks at the blade, still red hot amidst the coals. It's a huge sword. It's as long as Jon is tall. Gendry says, "I made it in the style of Ned Stark's sword in honor of his memory." Jon whispers, "Ice?" Beric says, "It's not called ice, it's called lightbringer." Jon approaches the Ice Palace. White Walkers stand guard around the entrance. He stops and dismounts from his horse with his son in his arm. The White Walkers encircle him, and the White Walker steps forward and reaches inside his coat, searching for a second weapon. "I'm unarmed," Jon says. The Walkers separate behind him, allowing him to enter the palace. The fifth flashback occurs. Beric tells Jon of the prophecy of Azor Ahai, and that Azor Ahai wielding Lightbringer will be the one to end the others forever, and how Melisandre for a long time believed Stannis would be the one to wield it, but it's now clear that Jon is Azor Ahai. Beric takes the huge sword from the coals and hands it to Jon. Jon looks at it intently, with the glowing blade reflecting in his eyes. Jon enters the Ice Palace and approaches the huge ice throne upon which the Night King sits. A small shelf is positioned in front of the throne. Jon has to kneel down in order to place his son on the shelf, and while kneeling, he looks up at the Night King. Slowly the Night King rises and moves towards Jon. They lock eyes and tears begin to well up in Jon's eyes. The Night King shifts his head ever so slightly at Jon, and Jon's tears begin streaming silently down his agonized face. The Night King watches on as the tears freeze and stick to the edge of his beard. Jon bows his head in sadness as he reaches up to his son and pushes him ever so gently towards the Night King. The Night King extends a single finger from his hand and looks down at Jon's baby boy. Slowly he lowers his fingertip towards the child's cheek when the glint of steel flickers in his blue eyes. With a flash, a dagger is drawn from under the baby's blankets. Jon whips the dagger back over his shoulder, and in an instant the blade erupts into flame. For the first time, fear twists the Night King's face in shock, and Jon plunges the dagger into his chest, slicing straight through his blackened armor like butter. The glow of flame begins to spark under the Night King's skin, and with a high-pitched scream, the Night King shatters like glass before Jon, as do the White Walkers in the palace, and all the others under the Night King's spell, until only Jon and his son are left. Jon stands before the weirwood tree in Winterfell. Snow is falling gently around him. In the distance we can see Dany walking towards him. Everything is in slow motion, and the voice of Melisandre begins to narrate the legend of Lightbringer and Azor Ahai. Darkness lay over the world, and a hero, Azor Ahai, was chosen to fight against it. To fight the darkness, Azor Ahai needed to forge a hero's sword. He labored 30 days and 30 nights until it was done. However, when he went to temper it in water, the sword broke. The second time, he took 50 days and 50 nights to make the sword, even better than the first. To temper it this time, he captured a lion and drove the sword into its heart, but once more the steel shattered. The third time, with a heavy heart, for he knew what he must do, he worked for 100 days and 100 nights until it was finished. This time, he called for his wife. Dany now stands beside Jon and looks lovingly at him. "You called for me?" She places a tender kiss on his lips. "I need to ask you to do something for me." "What is it?" "I need you to trust me." "I do trust you," she answers. "Then close your eyes." As she closes her eyes, he walks around behind the weirwood tree and picks up Lightbringer and circles around to behind her, sword in hand. Azor Ahai asked her to bare her breast, and when she did, he drove his sword into her breast, her soul combining with the steel of the sword, creating Lightbringer, while her cry of anguish and ecstasy left a crack across the face of the moon. With a shout of pain, he drives Lightbringer through her back, impaling her. Her mouth opens in a silent scream. The blade of the sword ignites in flames so intense that it melts the steel and crossguard of the sword, the flaming pieces of metal dropping into the snow, leaving only the blade inside Dany intact. As he withdraws the sword, which has now become a small dagger, Dany crumbles and falls. Jon catches her in his arms. Her confused and fearful eyes look up at him. "I'm sorry," he whispers. Outside the Ice Palace, Jon emerges with his baby son. An eerie silence hangs over the land, only the sound of the cold winds blowing over the mountaintops. Jon looks towards the south, and with a deep breath, the song of ice and fire has come to an end. At least, that's how I'd end it as well, and I think it's actually not that bad. It kind of ties up all the loose ends. Hopefully, you guys like it. If not, don't worry about it. But I just had to get that little bit of fan fiction out of my system, just so that I can convince myself that that's how the show ended, so I can be happy with it. I'm Bandit, this is Bandit Incorporated. Until next time, I will see you guys in the comments.